Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Ulf Sverdrup. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this NUPI seminar. And a special welcome to Minister of Foreign Affairs of Moldova, His Excellency Mr. Andrei Galbur. During the last few weeks, we had a long list of prominent politicians from southeastern part of Europe visiting NUPI. This week we hosted the Europe Minister of Greece, and we had the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine visiting us recently, and we had distinguished speakers from all over Western Balkans, from Montenegro, Kosovo and Serbia. So at NUPI we put a lot of effort into following the developments in the southeastern part of Europe, and we follow that closely. And I'm sure that the seminar today will add to our competence and knowledge of the region. Today, Minister Galbur will give a speech on the foreign policy objectives of the Republic of Moldova in the current international security environment. Moldova is, like Norway, a small country. But it finds itself not on the geopolitical fault line, but somehow the fault lines are crossing the territory, splitting the society. And also we have the issue of Transnistria. So the foreign policy of Moldova is very much a balancing act between advancing the European path, contributing to find a normal relationship with the Federation of Russia, and also sort out the internal domestic issues. And during his speech, the minister will address two key issues, as I understand. First, the systematic modernization of the country, and secondly, the need to stabilize the country and to solve the Transnistrian conflict. So we have a very experienced speaker with us today. He's a distinguished diplomat before joining and becoming a politician. He has more than 20 years of diplomatic experience. He was served in Washington, and he was the ambassador of Moldova to Moscow during the Ukrainian crisis. So I'm sure that he has a lot of experience and a lot of remarks, interesting things to share with us today. After his intervention, he has accepted to engage in a Q&A with us, and that session will be chaired by Helge Blakkesrud, who is the head of our Russia department. Let me also remind you that the first part of this seminar, his speech, will be streamed, so you're aware of that. So no further delay from my side. It's a great pleasure to have you here. It's great to see that so many of you have found the time to come here to listen to the distinguished speakers. So the floor is yours, Minister, please.
Thank you very much for granting me the opportunity to be here, and for the very kind words. I was looking forward to making this trip for quite some time, because the Nordic countries in general, and Norway in particular, have for long been steadfast supporters of Moldova modernization efforts. Moreover, this year we celebrate together with Norway 25 years of diplomatic relationship, and it's been a quarter of a century in which Norway has granted unconditional support for Moldova's modernization endeavors. It's also good to be here in this prestigious institution that is visited constantly, as I understand, by many officials from countries around the world. I personally believe, I strongly believe in the role of the think tank community and of the research and academic community in shaping the decision-making choices for politicians around the world. So taking this opportunity, I would like to share with you some thoughts about Moldova in general, and maybe its security challenges in particular. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disappearance of bipolar confrontation, we were excited that the old divisions were left behind, and our main objectives would be to build up or to construct a European continent free from dividing lines based on common principles and values. In the early 90s, after the Republic of Moldova gained its independence, we were inclined to think that due to its geographical location, we were quite well placed to play a role of a bridge, if you like, between north and south, west and east, and that primarily in the areas of trade exchanges and foreign investments. And while Moldova was trying to build on these perceived strategic advantages and managed to overcome quite a lot of difficulties of the transitional process towards a market economy, and also while remaining open to fulfill the role of this connecting bridge. The political and especially the security landscape in our region and also worldwide has evolved, unfortunately, quite regressively. We found ourselves confronted with a great deal of concerns that have been growing over the years. And if we compare the current security situation with what it used to be some 10 or 15 years ago, we can see that nowadays both Europe and the world are crisscrossed much more with all kinds of dividing lines. But first and foremost, these are geopolitical and ideological lines. In certain cases, and that is regretful, these fault lines turned into real front lines. The security environment changed swiftly and dramatically in the last years, and it continues to evolve. The liberal and democratic values are losing ground to the opposite ideals, including autocracy and dictatorship. We are witnessing a wave of distrust of large groups of citizens in democratic institutions and politicians. The media replicate and reinforce messages online, whatever the reality people subscribe to, no matter where you are on the political, cultural, or social spectrum. I would say this is a sort of harmonization or convergence of discontent, putting under pressure the very framework of a stable Europe and the transatlantic relationship. The polarized political climate and the right-wing populism is on the spot in many countries, paving the way for different forms of extremism, nourishing a public discourse characterized by xenophobia, confrontation, and disinformation. Although the outcome of recent presidential and parliamentary elections in France may have toned down these extremist trends, I think there are still reasons to be concerned. Although these developments are different in nature, they seem to have all of them seem to have as a common denominator the significant load of frustration and discontent amongst a large part of population that in its turn introduced a high level of uncertainty on the ground and triggered processes and changes the extent of which we can only imagine. They have all to be perceived as kind of a major wake-up call, even though for different reasons, and that is something that can be seen not only in the UK and the US, but in many European countries as well. To note that the most distinctive change in the European security landscape, as one of the major actors has practically proved it, consists in the readiness and capability to use military force and other more covert resources in order to achieve the objectives, easily running over any norm and principle of international law. Which means that the very foundation of peace and stability that has been jointly built as a consequence of two devastating wars and the lasting Cold War is basically compromised. Now countries have to quickly adapt to a new, uncertain, and unpredictable security environment in a new way. And this is exactly what they are doing. The EU, supported by non-EU countries and the US, imposed restrictive measures to Russia. The increasingly assertive Russia, in its turn, modernized its armed forces, reintroduced the old East versus West schismatic thinking, engaged in subversive actions against Western democracies, undermining European stability and security. And it's against this social and political background that the Republic of Moldova finds itself not on one or another side of this geopolitical fault line, but a country where, as it was already mentioned, where this line is effectively crossing the territory, breaks up the society, but most importantly, the mindset of the people. So for the authorities of Moldova, the key question is, will we be able to promote our strategic objectives in these current conditions? We have two most critical strategic objectives, and which we try to pursue in parallel. The first one is about systemic modernization of the country by strengthening democratic institutions, improving the respect for human rights, mobilize all the factors that can foster economic growth. And in our view, there is no better way to achieve this set of goals than by promoting political association and economic integration with the European Union. And we have the tool to achieve this objective, which is the association agreement with the European Union and its deep and comprehensive free trade agreement component, with the ultimate goal of joining the European Union. The second objective is to keep the country stable by increasing resilience, by reducing the internal divisions that in essence are a false theme for the Moldovan citizen, for the Moldovan people. This constant choice between East and West, between Russia and the European Union, is not a theme that dominates the hearts and minds of the people in Moldova. People in Moldova want to have a better life. They want a better infrastructure, they want better roads, they want better healthcare, they want better social benefits, they want jobs to enable them to stay inside the country rather as looking for employment someplace else. In this context, we also come to the security issue that we face inside the country, and that is the Transnistrian conflict, which is already 25 years old. I deem it important to underline here that this is not a conflict based on ethnic divide, on religious disagreements. This is a strictly political conflict based on ideological divide. The divide that I am talking about is crisscrossing the country and its people. I will not, again, dwell too deeply on the circumstances in which this conflict emerged in 1992, or even the beginning of the 90s. I will only remark that, by coincidence or not, such conflicts arose throughout the majority of former Soviet republics, with Ukraine completing this row, unfortunately, quite recently. Despite, as I said, the quasi-unanimous perception that the Transnistrian conflict would be the easiest to solve because it lacks the ethnic and religious components, after almost a quarter of a century of political negotiations, we have not yet succeeded in getting closer to a solution. Besides, this conflict reached a tipping point and constitutes a serious threat to both national and international peace and security. It continues to impact negatively Moldova's political, social and economic development, because it's always a drag when Moldova tries to make a push forward. But moreover, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Moldova continues to be compromised as foreign military forces continue to be illegally stationed on the national territory in flagrant violation of imperative norms and principles of international law. And I believe that fully entitles us to ask ourselves why this conflict along with many others in Europe, despite the attention given to them by the UN Security Council, by the OSCE and others, and despite the existing mechanisms of settlement, why is this not yielding any expected solution or result? That's why we will continue to insist on the importance of respect for principles and norms of the international law, which have to govern the interstate relations, and including the need to respect commitments, international commitments, especially with regards to the withdrawal of foreign troops stationing on the territory of another state, breaching the host nation consent principle. These and all other common challenges I refer to are very interlinked between themselves, and that makes the environment in which we operate as a government quite complex and challenging. But there's only one way to address them, and that is if we operate together, if we join our forces in countering political populism and Euroscepticism, the resurrection of economic protectionism, and last but not least, the return of brutal geopolitics into interstate relations. We would be seriously worried if the leading world powers would choose to strike a new grand bargain instead of supporting the order based on clear principles, shared values, and strong multilateral institutions. And I think in the case of Moldova, we even added a new element to this mix, which is the element of conditionalities, especially for countries that request support of external development partners. Those of you who follow closely developments in Moldova probably know that at the end of 2015 we were dealing with a very serious political and economic crisis generated by a very huge banking fraud in which public officials were involved. And we started to govern in 2016 at the lowest level of trust, both inside the country but also on behalf of our external partners. And when we approach Brussels with the question, how should we build our relationship further? How do we continue our engagement? We came to the conclusion that the time, let's say, for believing in nice statements and in nice words is over, or the honeymoon is over. We now have to base this relationship strictly on deliverables, on what this government is able to deliver. And those deliverables were fixed in a document, in a paper called the roadmap, with specific timelines. At the moment of drafting this document, we even referred to it as a bus schedule, where we know the final destination, but we also have concrete stops en route to that destination with specific times that we have to reach the bus stops. But we also agreed that at every other station we must have a fuel pump that will provide the necessary energy for this bus to continue its journey to the final destination. And in the case of Moldova, this worked. And we are ready to engage precisely in this manner. That's how we managed to secure an agreement with the IMF based on strict conditionalities, which on one hand provide the mobilization tool inside the country for the government to work together with the parliament to synchronize their agendas to make sure that we deliver on time, but also gave our development partners a monitoring instrument for them to observe whether we are living up to our commitments and whether we are delivering on the commitments that we made. And you don't have to take my word for it. Look at the latest report of the IMF that came out on the 1st of May, which had 3 significant conclusions. And we consider this to be the best diagnosis of where Moldova is in terms of governing right now. Conclusion number 1 was that the government is implementing reforms. Conclusion number 2 was that the reforms being implemented provide for a sustainable economic growth. And conclusion number 3 was that the government respects strictly its conditionalities. So I think this could be a good transitional arrangement or transitional formula for making the reform process in the case of Moldova work. But coming back to the broader existential questions that I raised in this presentation, I'm afraid there is no simple answer to these questions. And I think the future will only be able to show us what was the best strategy. In the meantime, however, our message to the leaders of the world is to cement the rules-based order, to build bridges, and not to allow the fault lines to lead to landslides that could simply crumble the existing world order. And what we constantly say in our message, both to the East but also to the West, is that Moldova is not a geopolitical player, and we don't want to be used in geopolitical games. We don't want to be a polygon for geopolitical experiments, but we are ready to be a platform, a field for geopolitical cooperation, exactly for the exercise of building bridges. So I will stop here, and I will look forward to have an interactive discussion with you. Thank you.